Hello and welcome back. We come now to the Great Depression and World War I in the United States. If you haven't already, remember to share and subscribe. Let's get straight into it. As the United States stepped into the new century, it was a confident, young great power arriving onto the world stage. The West had been conquered, and in industrial capacity, the United States was starting to catch up. By 1900, the United States was already the leading steel producer in the world. After the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, the United States swiftly became a colonial power too, taking the Philippines, Guam and other Pacific islands. With the swift colonization of Hawaii, the United States had acquired all a modern great power needed in the 1900s: land, population, an industrial base, a military and colonies. It had well and truly joined the world stage. The 1920s have a reputation for being the Gilded Age of glitzy and glamorous parties where people roared their way forward, money was plentiful and opportunity was everywhere. That is, until 1929 and the collapse on Wall Street that triggered a global financial crash of such proportions that nearly 20 years later the economy still hadn't properly recovered. The Great Depression was caused by wanton speculation on Wall Street. Such were the volumes of capital being moved around that practically everyone was invested. Stock tips were traded all the time. As Joe Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy, is supposed to have said, when you're taking stock tips from the shoe shiner, it's time to get out. Eventually, the market corrected itself and all those inflated stocks came tumbling down, and with it, the fortunes of millions of Americans. This caused a severe shock to aggregate demand, and the actions of the federal government were dictated by the ideology of classical liberalism: balance the budget and the economy will correct itself. This simply didn't happen. Because of what we understand today as aggregate demand, it's the sum total of what people want and what drives our modern economies forward. To put it simply, not enough people were buying because not enough people had the money to buy. This led to retailers losing their business as there were no sales to be made, and this then put out of business manufacturers because there were no retailers to sell to anymore. This pervasive cycle became almost self-sustaining through the 30s, and it is only with the New Deal and mobilization of the economy for war that things really started to change. But before we continue about the Great Depression, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson and World War I. This was arguably the United States' first true step as a great power, arriving in Europe as the war turned decisively against the Central Powers. The ailing Ottoman Empire was beaten back by a combination of colonial forces and the rebellious Arabs in Arabia. Germany, Austria and Bulgaria halted by a combination of Russian, British and French soldiers and eventually forced into surrendering as the blockade and casualties took their toll. As the war ended and the world took stock of a lost generation cut down for no reason, there was almost a sense of bewilderment. I'd like to stress here that World War I wasn't fought for moral reasons. There was no good versus bad aspect of this, no just cause. It was a war caused by dominoes falling of alliances being called into play from something that seems relatively innocuous in isolation: the assassination of the Grand Duke of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian terrorist. As threats were exchanged, the march to war began, and what seemed like a short war lasted 4 long years of slaughter. It awoke the conscience of Australia and New Zealand as separate entities from Britain, not just colonies, but truly separate entities. In India, it entrenched the independence movement as it did elsewhere. Thousands of colonial soldiers died in the trenches for their overlords for a war that did not need to be fought. The United States escaped much of the devastation, with Germany first beginning unrestricted submarine warfare, then halting at the US's outrage, only to begin again when they became desperate. This led to US entry in 1917, and the pouring in of fresh troops helped hasten the end as the exhausted armies of the Central Powers were pushed right back to Germany itself. The peace conference at Versailles was full of rife anger, and the sheer human devastation caused vengeance to be on the agenda. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, gains a lot of acclaim for his idealistic approach to enshrine the right to self-determination within the peace process, and his foresight in attempting to create a fair peace for Germany. This was not a war for territorial expansion, and so the idea of punishment doesn't really fit fairly. France under Clemenceau, however, sought blood. Clemenceau and France had fought two devastating wars with Germany in living memory, with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The peace treaty was harsh and cost France a significant amount of money and the surrender of Alsace-Lorraine. The revanchism in France demanded Alsace-Lorraine back, vast sums of money, and a way to neuter German military power moving forward. Britain, the preeminent colonial power of the world, also wanted to see the rising Germany cut off to prevent it challenging Britain's strategic interests in a very similar way to how the United States is currently feeling threatened by the rise of China. Sadly, Wilson's idealism failed, and Germany bore the brunt of the blame for a war that it didn't start, which helped spark the rise of Nazism and the Second World War. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered completely, which helped spark the continuing crisis between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and also the current issue with more radical Islam through the installation of the family of Saud over Arabia. Interestingly, for all of Wilson's progressivism in the field of international relations, in domestic affairs the man was a monster. He frequently wrote in favour of lost causism, cynical historian for you people curious about what that is. Wilson was also a harsh proponent of segregation and even screened the first movie ever at the White House, which was a KKK propaganda film in Birth of a Nation. I wanted to talk about the Great Depression a lot. For someone who was growing up during what is now dubbed the Great Recession in 2008, it's marked my entire teenage and adult life. The Great Recession wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been because of the lessons learned from 1929 and the actions of Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, chivying world leaders into acting. In 1929, however, those things didn't happen. An entire generation was utterly flattened by poverty and deprivation. This instability is one of the main causes of the Second World War, with the Nazis being hailed for their economic miracle in restoring the German economy, even though this was built on fraud through Mayfair bills. 3 Arrows did a good explanation of what that is, and I definitely recommend watching his video on that. Going back to the United States, we've all seen the iconic picture taken by Dorothea Lange of Florence Owen Thompson, and it conveys an ethereal sense of despair and hope, and many people have laughed at the goofiness of Lenny in Of Mice and Men, but we miss the true horror of the Great Depression amidst our distant lens. The scale of the contraction to the economy was huge. I cannot express just how bad it had gotten for ordinary working people. Homes lost and jobs lost, with hundreds of thousands on the move for any paid employment they could take. Women in every household used every single trick that had been passed down generations to stretch every single penny as far as it would go. Children were put off, and the very bonds of society started to fray. As a Keynesian, the answer for me is simple. The equilibrium, that is, the balance of the economy, was found as the market reacted to overinvestment and volatility, resulting in a situation where the theoretical optimum was far below what it actually was. The correction, as it's called, had a steep drop-off in aggregate demand, and this is one of the most important things I can ever talk about on this channel. When times are bad, aggregate demand drops. It's logical. The economy is struggling, so everyone tightens their belts. This causes more drops in demand as people stop spending. It doesn't seem like much, but could you imagine if in a village all 500 people cut down their pints drunk per week from 2 to 1? That's 500 less pints sold, meaning the farmer who produces the hops now has 500 pints worth that isn't needed. That costs jobs, it costs livelihoods. The Keynesian answer to this, which is what FDR implemented and what so many people on the left like Bernie Sanders were advocating for in the aftermath of the Great Recession. The idea was to literally give money to people so that they could continue to spend and to support businesses and spend our way out of a recession by propping up aggregate demand. This, to most people in the United States, sounds like an anathema, a horrific waste of money, and frankly, totally against the national ethic of not accepting handouts. And if it was just that, you could really understand. But this is good economics. It makes good economic sense. If in your local community, your local store loses its customer base by almost 50% almost overnight, that local store is going to really struggle, and that has a domino effect on other areas of your community. Because everything is so interconnected, toppling one domino can damage the entire system. Now in good times, when the economy is growing, you can absorb that hit, but when it happens everywhere, you can't. So the government has to act in our interests and support businesses and individuals, and that way the pistons of the economy can get moving again. This is precisely what the New Deal did, with some people simply being paid to dig holes and then fill them in again. But they got paid, and with that money spent it on things they needed, such as food, clothes and appliances. Those things needed stores, who now had new customers, and so eventually would take on more staff, which generated jobs, and now you've got the economy going again. Many leftists and Keynesians have issues with taking away that support because it is often very popular, but when the economy is going again, you slowly reduce these exceptional programs to pay down the debt that is accrued. It's called a counter-cyclical approach. When times are good, the government cuts spending and pays down debt. When times are bad, the government spends freely and doesn't worry about the debt. This marked period of struggle, of deprivation and horrific suffering awoke a consciousness in the United States that when the war was won, the generations of the future would not suffer how they suffered. Now this so-called greatest generation, these are not boomers. Boomers are these people's children. This generation chose to pay higher taxes and to put in place social welfare programs to help white Americans step forward with assurances of a social safety net. Black Americans were locked out of these programs. The generational dividend that I mentioned in my discussion with Econoboy stems from this period. The great economic injustices at the very heart of American society today stem from this period, and understanding how that happened is vital. But that is a discussion for next week, because we need to look at it in a bit more depth. So in this period, we find the making of modern America, the crash of '29 and the horror of the First World War, the rising preeminence of the United States in Europe and a change of the guard at home. Now, the United States would look forward, confident and assured that this new century would not be a century dominated by the old empires, but a new America, looking forward, eyes firmly affixed on what would be known as the American century. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week for part 3. I hope you've enjoyed this week, and if you like the content, help the channel grow. Remember to share and subscribe, and feel free to comment, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next week, goodbye.